Good evening. Welcome. We're so glad you're all here. This is Nature's Best Hope, as you know, with Doug Tallamy. I cannot think of a better way to kick off our Gallatin Valley Earth Day 2023 than with this fantastic event. This is the first of many Earth Day events that we'll be holding from now through April. And while I'm up here, I wanted to give a big shout out to all the people out there who are streaming this live online. We have 933 people that are out there, so say hello. Hello to you all. In fact, I want to say a special hello. There's one of those 933 links is actually a huge crowd in Billings. They're gathered for a watch party at the Montana Audubon Center. So hello to you guys out there. So my name is Ann Reddy, and I am the chair of the Gallatin Valley Earth Day Committee. And tonight, as you're probably guessing, you're in for a really big treat. I first heard Doug Tallamy give his talk over 10 years ago, and I am not exaggerating when I say that it was actually life-changing for me. I viewed my whole yard and my garden and my gardening completely different from then on. So, and I hope you enjoyed the free food and drink if you're here in person. And the book signing, we sold out of Doug's books, and we had exhibits in the ballroom. If you didn't get a chance to visit the tables there, please, I encourage you to visit GallatinValleyEarthDay.org, and you can find more information about our exhibitors there. So tonight is free for everyone, a free event, and it wouldn't have happened without the work and support from many individuals and organizations in our community. I am very, very grateful to our partners, Sacajawea Audubon Society and yay, Sacajawea, yeah. And the Montana Native Plant Society's local chapter, Valley of the Flowers. So thank you so much for partnering with us. And in addition, this evening is happening because of our underwriters. And I wanted to give a big shout out to them. Our premier sponsors are Gallatin Invasive Species Alliance, Great Bear Native Plants Nursery in Hamilton, Montana, Wild Birds Unlimited in Bozeman and in Billings, and we have a benefactor sponsor of Kenyon Noble, and our steward underwriters are Cashman Nursery, Blake Nursery, the Bozeman Community Food Co-op, and the City of Bozeman's Water Division. So thank you all. Really appreciate you all. Obviously, without their generous support, we would not be able to bring you tonight's program. Also, a big thanks to the Emerson Center for the Arts and Culture and our fantastic tech crew, which is Lorene Reed, Dakota Stordahl, and Bill Costigan of Poindexter's. Yay! Thank you. And lastly, I would also like to thank our event steering committee members. They have worked tirelessly for months and months to make this happen. So if you're in the audience, could you please stand up? I know Jennifer's one of them, but please stand up. Thank you guys. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all your hard work. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our MC for the evening, Jennifer Magic. Tonight's program wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Jennifer's idea to bring Doug Tallamy to Bozeman here and for her organizing the efforts to make that happen. So Jen is a Bozeman City Commissioner, and she has been advocating for the use of native and drought-tolerant plants on city land. She also works with environmental organizations on land use issues as a community planning consultant. Jen is a longtime Bozeman resident, and she loves to garden and spend time outdoors. And Jen and her partner, John Catton, they've replaced their lawn with native trees, shrubs, and plants, and they are now working on their front yard to do the same, I hear. So please join me in a warm round of applause to welcome our MC for the evening, Jennifer Magic.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much. Gosh, it is great to see such a terrific crowd tonight, not only here in person, but online. Thank you for taking this topic seriously and for being here. I'd like to call out our committee members. First, Ann Reddy is just incredible. I am so glad that she is in charge of our Gallatin Valley Earth Day events. Without her, this really would not have happened tonight. I didn't do that much. So, Ann, you're being very generous. So big shout out to Ann. Other committee members are Barbara Finney, Paulette Epple, Luann Harris, Laureen Reed, Beth Madden, Vicki Saab, Anna Vischer, and Gretchen Rupp. Such a great committee that did a tremendous amount of work to make this happen in a very short period of time. So the format for tonight, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Douglas Tallamy. He's going to speak. His presentation is about an hour long. We're going to take a short break, and during that time, you're welcome to leave if you don't want to stay for the question and answer period. But we are going to open it up for Q&A. And what we would like to do is have people come up to the front of the room. There is a microphone right here. So come and we'll line up. And we ask that you keep your narrative short and one question per person. We want to try to go through the Q&A fairly quickly so we don't have an evening thing that drags on and on. You know how those go. Our online attendees, Emma is back there and is going to help me with some of the online questions. So I will go to Emma a couple of times and we'll get questions from our online participants. So our speaker tonight, Dr. Douglas Tallamy, comes to us from the University of Delaware, where he has been a professor for the past 41 years in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Biology. He is an author. He has written numerous books, a variety and numerous scholarly articles, and has lectured across the country. His books include Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, The Nature of Oaks, and Nature's Best Hope, a new approach to conservation that starts in your yard. If you happen to read the December 14th issue of the New York Times just last month, you may have seen a headline that stated, "They fought the lawn and the lawn lost." It's a great headline. It's about a Maryland couple who were told by their homeowners association that they needed to replace their native plants with, can you guess what? Sod, turf, lawn. They filed suit and fortunately won. But Dr. Tallamy is quoted in that article, and he states, "This idea that humans and nature cannot coexist is destroying the entire planet, which in turn is destroying humans. The only way forward is to coexist." Dr. Tallamy's program tonight is indeed a message of hope, nature's best hope. And in our community, we're facing so much growth and rapid change, pressure, And we could all use a little hope right now. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Douglas Tallamy to Bozeman.
Well, thanks very much, Jen. People read these things I said. I don't remember saying them, but they sound pretty good. I said, well, I should have said that even if I didn't. But there's a difference about tonight's audience from my typical audience. Usually 70, 80, 90% of the audience is my age or older. But I've noticed today, this is the youngest audience I've ever talked to. And that's exciting to me. All right, I don't want to drag on and on and on. So we're going to get started. I want to talk about my idea of what nature's best hope is. But before we do that, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope is. E.O. Wilson, of course, died last year, the day after Christmas. It was a terrible loss to the world of conservation, to entomology, to myrmecology, he was one of the most notable scientists of our time, for sure. But one of the things that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of life on Earth and his efforts to save it, not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survivorship. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. If we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we have to save nature. We have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of planet Earth. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, sounds like a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside and everything will be great. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and we've got 8 billion people and all of our detritus and roadways and airports and everything else in the other half, and we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we actually do this? That's what I want to talk about tonight. I do think we can realize E.O.'s dream, but we need a new approach to conservation to do it. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happened in the East in 2019. We had a very large oak mast. Members of the Red Oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time, and this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained. So I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it, and I was rewarded. An insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that little hole. It was a tight squeeze. Finally it plopped down. That's a dangerous time for this insect larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it wiggles and squirms beneath the soil surface in about 30 seconds, disappears, and once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly stays underground in that chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do. Here's my little pointer. But that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and their mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts and chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in it, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the very next year? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development, so if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, once they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum, and you know that nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she's filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they've left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new acorn. It takes about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard right there, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays of all the species, and oaks. Jays, of course, are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and fly up to a mile, although I read the other day, 1.5 miles, a long way from the parent tree. And then they tap the acorn beneath the soil surface, and the objectives are going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. For every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So if you don't have a lot of carpenter ants, you won't have pileated woodpeckers, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Phacelia. That is the only plant, the only pollen that that bee can rear its young on. It turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have just about 4,000 species of native bees in North America, and over a third of them are highly specialized. There are 60 species of bees in California that cannot reproduce without perennial sunflowers. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot without white turtlehead. I could talk all night, all year, all decade about nature-specialized relationships. The point I want to make tonight, though, is that these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition, and those are typically the mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly, we have tilled it, we have drained it, we have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We've polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves, and each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need them to sustain, because that is what keeps us alive on planet Earth. So you might wonder why we've done all that. I wonder why we've done all that, and I don't know. But I suspect we thought that the Earth, our nest, was so big we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines at a regular clip these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. Now the UN says, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And they said it 2 years ago, so I guess that's the next 18 years now. Makes a nice headline, but it is not an option, folks. We have to make sure this doesn't happen. Those are the species that keep us alive on this planet. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. That's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if planet Earth lost its insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, those food webs would collapse and all those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do that. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do that we humans depend on every day, like produce oxygen, pretty important, clean water and slow that water to on its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants, of course, are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, building their tissues out of that carbon. And then even more important, they're pumping the carbon into the ground through their root systems the entire time that they're alive. And that's why our soils are brown or black. It's all the carbon that plant roots have deposited in the ground. And once it's in the ground, it's extremely stable. Will stay there thousands of years. Plants also build topsoil and hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather. They convert sunlight into food. If we lost our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight. That'll be a challenge. What do animals do for plants? Lots of things, but important things include pest control. They're providing pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people that are now demanding more ecosystem services than ever before. Now, we do have parks, we do have preserves. They're doing the best they can, but we are now in the 6th great extinction event that the Earth has ever experienced. So obviously, it's not good enough. We now need to start practicing conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like this. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups that have been good at doing that for long periods, but our huge Asian societies and our huge Western societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were smart enough that we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. They cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, and unfortunately it's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. But what I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to private property. Most of the land is privately owned. 78% of the country is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it correctly. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left that are not conserved already. We have conserved about 13% of the country so far. So good start, but we can do better. But we've taken apart so much of it that now we need to think about restoration. We need to rebuild the natural areas that we've dismantled. And before you tell me you're never going to put them back together again exactly the way they were, I get that. I know we're not going to. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions so that we create functional ecosystems again, even if it's not exactly what was on that space at some point in the past. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally, so we have to start with the most powerful groups, and there are two groups we can't do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun, and through photosynthesis turning it into food, and that is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. So now we have the energy from the sun stored mostly in plant leaves, other plant parts, but mostly in leaves. Now, most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat an invertebrate that ate plants, and most of those invertebrates are insects, but not just any insect. It turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we've got failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee that occurs near my house. But we've got several species of chickadees in the country, and they're all doing pretty much the same thing. They're the birds that are feeder all winter, eating seeds, and we tend to think, well, that's all they need. Well, actually, even in the wintertime, only 50% of their diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the winter. But when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they switch entirely to invertebrates, mostly insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they'll rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? There's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students did a few years ago, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers around the country. Some of you might have participated. And she said, please take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they're bringing food to the nest and send those pictures to me, and I'm going to identify the prey items in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in North America as possible. And you're looking at a summary of her results. It was very successful. She got thousands of pictures. The green bars are the percentage of the nestling diets in the 20 most common bird families that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of those 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen if we removed caterpillars from our landscapes? Most of our birds would not be able to reproduce. So it seems like there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. Thin wrapper is his exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. If you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. The beak's like a plunger. You just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids, but you want to chase 200 aphids, you get one caterpillar. They're nutritious, they're high in fat, high in protein, low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and many beetles have a lot of sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids. Oh, look, he's chasing aphids. Here we go. Best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. I talk about carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate. And birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from during the breeding season? From all those things they're bringing back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content of bird prey is not equally distributed. These first two bars over here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars. Here are the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way over here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts for most birds' diets. They are essential parts for most birds' diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? Or one or two a day enough? Well, that's a good question. So let's go back to chickadees. There are a lot of data on Carolina chickadee. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands of caterpillars, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, to get a nest of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest, to the point where they fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count those. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make one clutch of a bird that is a third of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you've got to have all those caterpillars in your yard because they only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not create all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major factors causing the bird declines that we're seeing out there. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al., that's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years, and we divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups. The species that require insects at some point in their life history, typically when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So finches and doves and crossbills, they can actually reproduce on seeds. They make a little milk out of seeds and rear their young on that. And look, the species that do not require insects did not decline at all in the last 50 years. But the species that require insects declined on average 10 million individuals per species. So it doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take away bird food, you lose the birds. So we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing. They've got to be pretty. Okay, we're not going to give that up. They're still going to be pretty, but now we have to make pretty landscapes that are ecologically functional, and we're not going to do that unless we add caterpillars to those landscapes. So how do we do that? Well, you add caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. Seems pretty straightforward, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we're selecting. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And nothing illustrates it better than the monarch butterfly. You can have all of the crepe myrtle and all the camellias and all the ginkgos and all the Bradford pears and all the burning bush and all the barberry and all the things that we typically landscape with from Asia in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweed species. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only develop on particular lineages of plants. Why is that? Well, plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and turn it into their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. Now, if this were summertime, I'd tell you to go outside and eat a plant after the talk and see if you liked it. You're not going to like it. That's why it's green in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. There's a reason that we can't get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. But we do know that insects eat plants, so how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are what we call host plant specialists. They can only eat the plants for which they have the adaptations to circumvent, to get around those chemical defenses. They have specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history for all those adaptations to fall into place, and once they do, the insect's locked into eating them. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, the monarch is not going to start to develop on your hostas. It's locked into eating milkweeds. It has 2 choices at that point: fly away and find milkweeds someplace else, or starve to death. So it turns out there's 3 types of plants out there. There's plants that contribute energy to local food webs. There's plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs. And there's plants that actively detract energy from local food webs. Oaks are the best contributors that we have in 84% of the counties in which they occur. And I am aware that they do not occur here. So we'll talk about that. But around the country, they are the big hitters. Ginkgos, perfect. Ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a perfect example of an ornamental plant that is not contributing. It's not invasive, it's not moving around, but nothing eats a ginkgo, so it's not adding anything to the local food web. And Bradford pear is a wonderful example of a invasive plant, an ornamental sold all over, particularly in the east, highly invasive. That's what it looks like when it escapes. Not only is it not contributing energy to a local food web, but it's pushing out the plants that do, so it's detracting energy. So all I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to rebuild the food webs that run the ecosystems that we're trying to restore, we have to choose the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants, starting with my house, I should say our house. in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000 to a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. It was a very old farm, been farmed for almost 300 years. Soil was exhausted. The last thing they did was mow it for hay. So our goal was to put it back together again. And that was our goal before we actually knew how to put it back together again. But one of the things I wanted to do was I like caterpillars. So I wanted to bring caterpillars to the property. And I knew I had to put in the plants that they use. And the first thing I tried was the Canadian owlet. I'd never seen a Canadian owlet. And people say, why'd you choose a Canadian owlet? Because I went through Dave Wagner's Caterpillars of Eastern North America, and I said, that's a pretty one. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow rue. And we didn't have any meadow rue. There used to be meadow rue there hundreds of years ago, but long gone with all the agriculture. So I got some meadow rue seeds someplace, planted them, grew very nicely, but this was early on, and I actually had very little faith the Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. But then I was walking by for another reason. I looked over, it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still surprised about that. So now I have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. We've added 2 species to the property that weren't there before. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway, that beautiful moth. Actually has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa, but I did know where there was a population in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them at home, grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, this year they took over my front yard. So I left them. But it took a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Biden's. But they did, and now we have a good population of both of those organisms. So now we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted to see if I get the hackberry emperor on our property. Not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that should be there, and as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis. And we didn't have any hackberry. Same story. Planted hackberry, planted about 4 trees, had to wait 4 years for the butterflies to find my hackberry, but they finally did, and now we have a good population of both of those, so we've added 6 species. And that's how it went. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Now, this is one that has not come, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't come, but it's still part of the fun. That's what the caterpillars look like. It's anticipation, like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I check my goldenrod. One of these years I'm going to find it, and that'll be a great year. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear people don't like Virginia creeper. I just don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It's a great ground cover. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. Makes nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. And by nutritious, I mean they're high in fat. Our fall birds, our migrating birds need high-fat berries because the energy content in fat is twice that in sugar, and that's what they need for migration. And it's a great pollinator plant. Its flowers are tiny and inconspicuous. You don't even know it's in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent at our house, just because it's such a cool-looking caterpillar. Looks like a stegosaurus. Even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. Well, it's a specialist on elm, but particularly American elm. And of course, we don't have any American elm. We lost it to the Dutch elm disease decades ago. But there are 2 big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. So I got some seeds. Scraped them out of the gutter, planted them at home. They germinate in 6 days. They grow very quickly. Those trees are now 80 feet tall. And yes, they brought in the double-toothed prominent, another big success, American elm. Wanted to see if I get the evening primrose moth at our house because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, of course, it eats evening primrose, and we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that. The moth came. It spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded, but it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oak trees. Now, I'm going to focus on oaks for a while just because they're such important plants. But that's not the only things we put in on our property. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether this tree is 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, that's right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local food web, and that's one of the goals, remember, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to bring in the moths that made the caterpillars that run the food web at my house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bugulatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of caterpillars. I want to clap for oaks, too. It's true. I'm sorry you guys don't have any oaks, but yeah, hundreds more species have come to the oaks that I put on our property, and look, they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that plant. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to contribute. It's what our yard looks like today. Actually, that's just before the Biden's Aristosa took over my front yard. We put a lot of the plants back. And this is the general point here. Any biome you're in, you put the plants back, things return. I found through my research, I liked moths, but it's a good thing because it turns out they're really important. And if you count the number of species of moths, not butterflies, but moths, in your local food web, you have a very good index of how productive and stable that food web is. So 5 years ago, I decided to undertake the challenge of counting all the species of moths that have come to our property since we put the plants back. I am still at it, but I'm up to 1,199 species of moths that I've taken pictures of so far. Conservation works. Now, we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we've got 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state because we put the plants back. And because so many of these moths are types of bird food, we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our property. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline you see all the time. World Wildlife Fund says that 2/3 of Earth's wildlife have disappeared since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I am convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We could turn very horrible headlines like this around. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres. A lot of people have less land than that, particularly in suburban and urban areas. Will it work on smaller properties? Very good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, where they have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. All their neighbors have the big lawns. And when they moved into their property, it was loaded with bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle, another serious invasive around the country. So the first thing they did was get rid of the bush honeysuckle. They planted 70 species of native plants, added what they call a bubbler, a water feature to their yard, and then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their property, and they are up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. If there are any birders in here, you know that that's a good number. Just to compare that to our house, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, right on the other side of that wall over there is O'Hare Airport. And she's got 1/10 of an acre, which is 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's not connected to any natural area at all. So she is a tiny little island in the middle of Chicago. It's a pretty island because Pam is a native plant landscaper and she knows how to do it. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature. Then she sat back and she says, with a glass of wine, and counted the birds that are using her. I shouldn't say that. Maybe she's making them up. She's up to 124 bird species that she has identified with her wine, but that are using her yard, but including a woodcock. Look, she documents it. There's her woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Chicago. Go to Pam's house. It's sitting right there. All right, 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And we do want to succeed in a big way. One of them is we've got to shrink the area that we have dedicated to lawn in this country. That says 40 million acres is actually up to 44 million acres nationwide that are dedicated to an ecological landscape, ecologically dead landscape. That's an area bigger than New England, all of New England. And of course, we know why we do this. A lawn is a status symbol. And we also had to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? Notice I'm not saying get rid of lawn. I'm saying cut the area of lawn in half. What if we took areas like this and turned them into this? I got this picture from Dan Getman. I've never met Dan Getman, but he sent me this picture and said, look, I had this giant lawn and I'm putting in native plants just like you say. So Dan's doing it. Well, let's make the math simple. Let's say we've got 40 million acres. That would give us 20 million acres that we could restore. We could make ecologically functional. In other words, we could create a new national park right at home. So I'm calling it Homegrown National Park, and it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, plus Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park is going to be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? What do you get when you put some part of nature right where you live? You get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with Mother Nature, right? You know, at your own time, your own pace. All you have to do is go outside, or maybe even just look out your window. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, 375 million people did that last year, so it can be crowded. It's free, there's no admission fee, no travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is essential to developing that personal relationship, not mediated by somebody else. And I think it's particularly important for our poor kids. Richard Liu says they're suffering from nature deficit disorder. So we're trying. We had 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they travel for an hour, and they go to a natural area, they walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. And they get back on the bus, and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and get to know it, become friends with it, alone, no parental supervision. They will come home again. When we hover over our kids, we are sending the message that this is dangerous stuff, this is scary, this is something you should fear, and that is not the message we want to send about taking care of nature. Our kids are the future stewards of the planet. If they're afraid of it, they don't know what stewarding is. If they don't love stewarding, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. Maybe they will learn to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature. It's a little piece of lawn with a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. And when she learned that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground, and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard. You put it in an aquarium. You learn how to take care of the lizard. You learn how to become a good steward. You fall in love with that part of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture not too long ago, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember her experiences with lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life, and I guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet because of that. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranisti's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose kids to the outdoors right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it now. You go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and you register your property on the map. It's free. Doesn't cost anything. The object is to register where you live and the amount of area of your property that you are being a good steward of or you're going to be. It's kind of like a pledge. So maybe you are going to cut the area of lawn in half. Maybe you're going to put some valuable plants in your yard. So that'll all be recorded, and then your little space in your county is going to light up. And of course, the goal is to get the entire country to light up, to get this message that everybody is an important component of the future of conservation. We want that message to go viral. What are we asking? We really do want you to reduce the area in lawn. Lawn's contributing nothing. And you should do that by planting more natives, removing invasives. Most people do have invasive plants on their property, and they don't even know it. If you're protecting any natural areas that you own, that's great. You want to keep doing that. Homegrown National Park's ecological products, of course, will be a significant increase in biodiversity, and what's happened on our property demonstrates that it does happen. Also, a measurable reduction in invasive species. We're getting rid of those. What I didn't tell you is that our 10 acres was 100% invasive species before we started, so we got rid of those. A significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. The very worst way to sequester carbon is with lawn. So if you replace it with any other plant, it's going to sequester more carbon. And then what we're doing is transforming the areas outside of our protected parks. From right now, they're no man's land. We're transferring them into viable habitats. There's a sociological product too, though. We're creating national awareness, not just of what the problem is, but what the solutions are. We want to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not something we can do without, and everybody has a responsibility to sustaining it. We're going to convert hope into action. This is something everybody can do right where they live, and it's not very hard. Doesn't rely on governmental support. We're not a government agency. What we want people to do is to take care of their own properties. It has nothing to do with the government. And it also is going to merge national conservation efforts, things like Audubon and National Wildlife Federation and Wild Ones, a whole bunch of organizations out there, into one aspirational visual. Everybody gets on the map, and we can see how well we're doing on private property. We need to measure that as well. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to join Homegrown National Park. What plants should we put in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. If you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that are going to hold up that house. They're the foundation. They're the support. You can't build an ecological house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do in the past. So the question is no longer simply, are natives ecologically better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are. But there are a lot of native species that aren't contributing all that much either. So the real question is, do we want to favor the biggest contributors, the most powerful plants that are supporting the most bees and the most caterpillars, or not? So what is the top keystone plant in Montana? In many of the northern states, actually, it's not oaks anymore. It's willows. Believe it or not, they're supporting 314 species of caterpillars in Bozeman. They're also excellent plants for pollinators, those early pollinators, because they bloom so early. Oh, we didn't get that figure in there. It's 698 species of caterpillars nationwide. On willows. So it's a very important plant. Not as good as oaks, but pretty good. So how do you find out exactly what the best plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder on National Wildlife Federation website and put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the best woody and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. So here are the best woody plants. You've got willows, you've got populus, you've got prunus, betula, ulmus. Oak's not even on there. You don't have. Now, I've heard people say the bur oak will grow here. There are a lot of oaks that will grow here, but you've removed them from the animals that use them. So moving them outside of their natural range is not going to make them powerful plants. You want to stick with what normally grows here. This is a typical list. You're going to find this not just here, but in lots of places. Asters, goldenrods, sunflowers, they're usually the top plants in terms of supporting specialist pollinators. When you're making a pollinator garden, you want to plant for specialists because the generalists will use those plants as well. If you have asters, goldenrods, and sunflowers, you're going to support more than 40 species of specialists that won't be there if you don't plant those plants. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of plants, a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of research showing that light pollution is a major cause of insect decline around the world. These are all the ways that lights are killing insects at night, particularly those moths that are creating all those caterpillars. But this is good news to me. It's good news because we've got to turn around insect decline, not just stop it. We've lost more than 45% of the insects on the planet at this point. They are the little things that run the world. So we need to turn that around. And if we can do that by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There are a lot of switches to flick. But look, not as many switches in Montana. That's good. But I know what you're going to say. Well, gee, I can't take the security light off my barn, or I can't take it off my porch or my garage because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on it. So it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you realize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, this is even easier. Take the white bulb out of your security system and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow incandescent or LED, they come in both types. Insects are not attracted to yellow wavelengths, particularly moths, hardly at all. So if we switched out our white lights for yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if you use LEDs, we'd save millions of dollars as well. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system, and then we're going to kill all the insects with mosquito fogging. I don't know how much you guys do this, but this is a booming business around the country. Mosquito foggers, Mosquito Joe, you call them in to kill all the adult mosquitoes. And he says it's okay because it's a natural product. They're fogging pyrethroids. That's the product that is found in chrysanthemums. It evolved there to kill insects. So because it's a natural product, it's okay. I don't buy that because cyanide is a natural product too, and it's not okay. He also says it only kills mosquitoes. And boy, I wish he was right about that. In fact, it kills all the insects that it comes in contact with, including monarchs. Big monarch killed 2 years ago, hundreds of dead monarchs on the ground when they flew through mosquito fogging. The interesting thing, the ironic thing is it does not control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. It's too hard. You have to kill 90% of the adults to get good control. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50%, so it's not even close to actually being functional. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you control them in the larval stage, and biocontrol is a wonderful way to do it. Using mosquito dunks. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay, put it out in the sun, let it ferment for a couple of days, and you're building up the populations of algae and diatoms, and that's what mosquito larvae eat. So this becomes an irresistible brew to female mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs. They will lay their eggs in your bucket, then you go to the hardware store and you buy a sheet of mosquito dunks. $9, $12. Put in a mosquito dunk, it's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera, and the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is mosquito larvae. So it's extremely targeted. If a dragonfly gets in there, it's not going to hurt it a bit. If your dog drinks it, it's not going to hurt it. You might put a coarse screen over so the local ground squirrel doesn't commit suicide, but it's cheap, and if everybody did it, it really would address the mosquito problem in something that's a functional way. But if you have a bad mosquito night, get a fan. Plug it in, you create a directed stream. Yeah, the mosquitoes will not fly into it. It's a way to enjoy your yard without killing anything. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows those important caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillars eat the leaves, they spin a cocoon and hang from one of the branches, they emerge as an adult, and they do it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish that was true for all of the things that use oaks or any of the trees, but it's not. Most of the species, at least 94% of them, finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, and then they drop from the tree, wiggle their way underneath the ground, and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. It's messy. And we mow and compact the areas under our trees so that they're rock hard, so it's very tough for those caterpillars to get underground, which means we've created an ecological trap. If we do put in those powerful plants and the caterpillars come, they drop down, they will die. I'm convinced that this type of landscaping is another major cause of insect declines around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. This is what most people do. You have a tree in a yard. I've got a new grad student this year who's starting to measure how well caterpillars do in a situation like this, but I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a layered landscape. You've got a tree, and then you've got layers, maybe a dogwood and native azaleas and ferns and ground cover and leaf litter under there. It's soft landing. Caterpillars fall down. They can easily get underground. Nobody's going to step on them. Nobody's going to mow them. Nobody's going to compact the soil. Survivorship will be much higher. This is a great place to do your fancy gardening, your spring ephemeral gardening. What you're doing is you're putting beds around your trees. It's the perfect way to reduce the area of lawn. Just put big beds under your tree. The bigger, the better. They're all safe sites for those caterpillars. Use native ground covers, wild ginger. This is native pachysandra, Virginia creeper, all kinds of native ground covers. Golden seal. Find ones that are appropriate for where you live. What is that? Mayapple, foam flower, ferns. All of these are safe sites. If you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants. Green mulch is the way to go. Another former grad student, Desiree Narango, did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and her results suggest that there is room for compromise in our choice of plants. She had one simple question. How well do suburban yards support chickadee populations when they're dominated by native plants versus when they're dominated by non-native ornamentals? And the first thing she found is when they're dominated by non-native ornamentals, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you reduce the chickadee food availability by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. All the landscapes had chickadee boxes up in there, but the birds would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. We looked at woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. That's replacement rate. That dotted line is the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. If you breed at that rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, anything above that line, you have a growing population. But if you make fewer babies, then you have an unsustainable shrinking population. And that's what happens when you have a high percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard. So right here is where those lines intersect, and it suggests that liberally interpreting this, you can have up to 30% of the woody plants in your yard non-native without destroying your local food web. Now, we can't tolerate any invasive plants because they're ecological tumors. They just escape and castrate our local ecosystems. But there are a lot of ornamentals that are not invasive. Back to Dan Getman's yard here. This is a ginkgo. Anybody pick that up the first time? Why does Dan have a ginkgo in his native plant landscape? Because Dan's wife said, I like ginkgos and I want you to put one in, and he did. Is that destroying the functionality of that landscape? No. Is it invasive? Is it going to escape and wreck the local woodlot? No, it's just there. So I tend to think of plants that are just there. They're not contributing, but they're just there as statues. So there you go. If everything Dan had was a statue, it wouldn't work very well, but we can tolerate it. It's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of those powerful contributors, the native plants that are doing most of the work, that destroys our food webs. So if we get more of those into our landscapes, there is room for compromise. Can we use native plants formally? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. You don't get more formal than that. Taken by a drone 400 feet up. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant. So formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a landscape like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbor this is not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. It's not very big. It could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help those pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? It's not because they pollinate a third of our crops. That figure is actually about a 1/12 of our crops. But I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. It's because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. We need pollinators everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. How about this? Drew Latham design. Much bigger. Imagine the amount of life that is supported by that planting versus the amount of life that's here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. And many of them are doing it. Minnesota's got a cost-sharing program. It's several years old now. That's very popular. The state is helping homeowners reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very popular. Pennsylvania has a similar program now. It's not nearly as old, but it's again popular. There are islands. There's an island off of Florida that is encouraging homeowners to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. A burrowing owl is a listed species. Actually, they're paying homeowners to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yards. It's the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, in my view, using carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to be a good steward of it, rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on these plants. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did with calorie pear, Fayetteville, Arkansas. South Carolina's banned them altogether. North Carolina's got a bounty on them. You take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Water utilities giving people $100 coupons to plant water-efficient native plants. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in California where they don't have one drop of water to waste on lawn. That's gone up now. It's $3 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn you replace with appropriate xeric plantings. And if you want more information on all of those programs, memorize that. Okay, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and the first one's a big one. We've come to think of nature as if it's optional. We like it, we like to visit it, we like to take pictures of it, but it's not essential. Which means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, we want to save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. They're wonderful places, we want to preserve them so that future generations can enjoy it. And I get that, nature's enormously entertaining, but it's much more than that. We want to save nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. We talked about this, but if we restrict conservation just to the places where we don't have a lot of humans, we're going to fail because there's not enough of those places. They're too small and too isolated. David Quammen has a great analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug, and that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance, and I don't like that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to put the plants back, folks. We need to glue our rugs back together again, not just to make biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to recreate viable habitats where we've destroyed them by putting the plants back. This is starting to happen. It's starting to happen. And when it continues, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans actually have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep is to leave Earth stewardship to a few specialists, few ecologists, few conservation biologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet, but I don't know why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody have the responsibility? Everybody have the responsibility of being a good steward of those ecosystems, of taking care of them. Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good earth stewardship. That doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live, and if you do, it empowers you. More and more of us are getting it. The earth has some serious problems now, and it really is easy to think that there's nothing I can do. I'm powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can put in keystone plants, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can remove the invasives from their property. We didn't even talk about that very much. One person can modify their light system, one person can fire Mosquito Joe. There's a whole bunch of things that one person can do to totally revitalize the little ecosystem on their property, and then that will enhance the greater local ecosystem around them rather than continuing to degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park, a preserve. They're all underfunded, they're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the responsibility, and we certainly have the power to change dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hi, Doug. Thank you so much. I am unsure of ways to talk to people who don't quite see the big picture. What would you say to somebody that says, I don't care about birds. I shouldn't have to plant native species if I don't like birds, period?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. They want me to take this entire talk and make it a one-liner. That's hard. That's hard. What I would say, and what I do say, is you don't need to care about birds. You should care about yourself. You are not going to exist on this planet without functioning ecosystems. The birds, the insects, the flies, everything is part of that ecosystem. And the more species that are in it, the better it runs, the better you are supported. So if you care about your future, if you care about the future of your kids and your grandkids, if you care about anything else around you, even if you don't like birds, you've got to restore the ecosystems that we've destroyed. We are on an unsustainable downhill, sled ride right now. Unsustainable means it can't be sustained. We can't be part way sustainable. That's a non-compromising word. We've got to reach sustainability or we're all in trouble. You could also go for the social responsibility end of it. You say, I don't care about birds. Well, you're hurting everybody else. What you do on your property, it's not like Las Vegas, where what stays in Vegas or what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens to your property doesn't stay there. If you kill all the bees on your property, it affects everybody else. If you wreck the watershed with your big lawn, you're affecting everybody else. So you have a social responsibility to the greater ecosystem and everybody in it around you. So to say, well, I don't care about any of this, I don't know. Tell them they're a bad person. No, that won't work.
All right, thank you.
But those are. I mean, they usually come around. They're saying that out of ignorance, really.
Sure.
And
Or
what
I
you're going to do
hear-
is solve that.
Yeah, or I hear like, oh, I see deer and raccoons.
Yeah,
I've got
yeah.
wildlife here.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, Emma, do you have a couple of questions from our online folks?
Yes, so a couple of people asked about quantity versus variety. When you have limited space, you want enough of a given species to support the insects that are going to be eating it, but how do you balance that versus variety of species?
Yeah, another good question. And of course, if you have a bigger amount of space, you want both. You want quantity and diversity. But with a smaller area, I get it. You can't do everything. I have heard too many times people say, I planted a milkweed, a worm got on it and ate all the leaves, so I squished it. The worm, of course, is the monarch that you're trying to support. And one milkweed rammet is not enough. You need a milkweed patch. Now that rammet, they didn't kill it. It'll come up the next year and there'll be 2 and 3. But plant enough that would be a basic requirement for simple reproduction by one female. You know, a female monarch's flying around, she sees a milkweed, she'll lay an egg on it. Then she's looking for another one. Oh, that's the only one there, I'll lay another egg on it. All of a sudden there's 3 or 4 eggs on it. That's too many for that one little bed. So that's a perfect example where you want more. Again, you don't have oaks, but anybody who does, or anything that requires another individual to reproduce. If they're wind pollinated, the pollen has to blow from another individual. If you only have one individual, you're not going to get pollination and you'll never make any acorns. So you have to know a little bit about what you're planting, whether they're dioecious or monoecious. So if you have a small property, I would plant more of fewer things and be happy with it. Remember, you are part of a matrix. I hope you're not the only one in your neighborhood doing this, because they can help you diversify. They can get some of the things that you don't have, particularly if you've got more shade and they've got more sun. This is a great way to work together with your neighborhood association so that you can divvy up the ecological responsibilities. It doesn't all happen on just a few square feet.
Thank you so much for this. My daughter gave me your book a couple of years ago, and I love it, and I really enjoyed hearing you in person. You're just a great dynamic speaker, and I love your answer for the previous person who said, when someone says, I don't care about birds, what can I do? To me, it feels a little bit like some of the frustration of trying to talk about some of the bigger issues with animals and corridors and not having people kind of get it. And sometimes we come at it in such a strong way when we care that somebody kind of goes, well, here she is again. And going with the idea of catching more flies with honey maybe than vinegar sometimes, beyond saying, if you don't care about birds, do you care about you?
Yeah.
Have you found any particular way, phrase, quickie little elevator speech when somebody starts.
Here it comes again.
Yeah. Sorry. I do this a lot. So somebody's talking about that or they don't get it, and you find that you're just getting so frustrated, and you go, well, is there a way I can sneak around from the side, and get your attention?
I thought of using lawyerese, maybe saying,
okay.
Whereas non-native plants don't support the life around you, whereas native plants do, whereas you need it to live, we need native plants. There's 4 whereases, but I don't know. It's all saying the same thing in different ways.
Do you know what I mean, I'm a writer, and I keep trying to do that with other issues like wolves or bears or native things, and it's like people can tell when you're passionate. They know how you feel so often, certainly around here, and it's like, well, maybe just to go back to the simplicity is you care about you. I mean,
Well, but when you say we got to have nature, you've got to have balanced trophic levels.
Yes.
When you have plants and herbivores and no predators, that's what we have back east with the white-tailed deer.
Right.
Actually, we've got it across the country. We've got too many deer everywhere, and it's devastating our forests. There's no recruitment. We've got Lyme disease. We've got everything else and it's not the deer's fault. But there's nothing controlling their numbers. It also increases the invasibility of a lot of plants because the deer eat the native plants and not the non-native ones. So all of a sudden the competition is switched. So that's why bears and cougars and those other things, wolves, are important in terms of keeping ecosystem balance.
Well, maybe I'll just keep working at it, trying to find a funny way to connect. Well, there is hope. I mean, I've got 3 grandkids who are being taken outside by their kids, and my daughter even said to me, thank you for taking me out when I was a kid, and I want you to do that for my granddaughter. So there's hope for the little kids, and certainly around here. But,
well, that's the other thing. We're so separated from nature now. No wonder we don't think we need it. Hey, look, we're all happy, we're full, and we don't have any nature. So so Doug Tallamy's full of it.
I'll keep working on it. But I really enjoyed your speech. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, there are a couple questions about how to remove specific invasive species and just where to find guidelines and advice on removing specific types of invasives?
Well, these days we've got the Google. It really is a wonderful resource. It wasn't a wonderful resource 10 years ago. But wherever you are in the country, you can put in the plant, say, how do I remove this? And you'll get a whole series of suggestions. In general, I think controlling woody invasive plants is easier than controlling the herbaceous ones because you cut them off at the base. Now you can, a lot of people say, I will not use any herbicide. You can do that if you want to cut it off at the base every 2 weeks for the rest of your life. You can eventually exhaust the root system, or you can whack it out. That's pretty good. It's a lot of labor. Or you can cut it off and then paint herbicide on the trunk, which is very little material. I think of it as chemotherapy. It's if you've got tumors in your body, you want to kill them, and yes, it's poisonous, and you don't want to have to do that. But if you don't do it, it's not good. It's the same thing with our invasive plants. Not controlling them, I think, is worse than using a little bit of herbicide. So that's my personal opinion. So for specific species, I have to know what species you're talking about, but I try not to spray when I don't have to. I almost never spray because you always hit non-targets. That's why I get my little paintbrush, and I don't do it very much either. But you got to kill the roots. If you don't kill the roots, it's coming back.
Thank you, Doug, for being here. I have a native tree that didn't make your short list tonight that I've known from reading your book supports a lot of insect life, but it's a very controversial tree when talking to people about natives, and that's cottonwoods. Could you talk about those?
That's controversial. Cottonwood's a keystone plant in the West. In many places, they take over the role of oaks. They support a lot of things. My little list there, it's populous. It's what, third down? And of course, you find it along riparian corridors. So what don't we like about cottonwoods? The fact that they make the white fluff? And yes, that's it. Life is full of trade-offs. People don't like oaks because they make acorns and you trip on them. There's always something, but it's a wonderful plant, and they simply drop out far east. There's one in my neighborhood, but they're not common at all. So I wish we had more. It's a very powerful plant.
My question may go back to the one previously. We're up here visiting, so I'm not sure if they have it up here, but we have a lot of poison ivy and poison oak. It just overruns all of our garden items. Is that one of those invasives that you need to eliminate, or is that part of normal nature?
Okay. The definition of an invasive plant is a non-native plant that's aggressively displacing native plants. So poison ivy and poison oak are both native plants, which means they can't be invasive. They can be aggressive, and you can say, I don't want them. But I'll tell you, when you get poison ivy and poison oak, it's when you try to get rid of it.
That's for sure.
My yard is filled with poison ivy too. We don't have poison oak, but there's some good parts. Let's talk about the good parts. They climb up the trees with all these little hairy things, and they don't girdle the trees. They don't pull them down. They make really nutritious high-fat berries for the birds in the fall. They do support a number of caterpillars. The best defense against poison ivy is to learn what it looks like and not touch it. But I'll tell you what happens when you get it.
Oh, I know. But how do you keep it off your flowers? I mean, if it just takes over like a bed.
Yeah. So if it's really right in your primary beds, yeah, you gotta get those gloves on. And I would say wintertime, don't burn it. Because
I know that. Believe me, I've had once, and that was a mistake.
Yeah. Best time is during the winter time, and then I would just yank, or you can paint those stems as well. But some people just go crazy, and they're probably trying to get rid of all of it, and it's just ignore it.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
My quick question is of the different types of willows that we have out here, is one variety better than another, like the sandbar or the Bebs?
Right. I get that question for everything, and the short answer is we don't know. Nobody's done the studies comparing all of them. Back to the oaks, there's 91 species of oaks. Have we compared all of them? No. I don't know. There's a lot. Maybe close to 90 species of willows. There are a lot of willows. But in general, and there's good evidence for this, the insects that are adapted to a genus of plant, the genus shares the same chemical defenses. And willows are a real good example. It's salicylic acid, that's their defense. All the willows have it, even the non-native willows have it. And the insects, if they're good at doing that, they can eat all of them. But specifically, have I compared everyone? No. But I would say use the one that's going to grow best where you're planting it. So some willows are better where it's a little bit drier. Right. You know, they all want some water, but.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's one interesting question from online. How pure should we be with our restoration efforts, as in looking at species that are naturalized but not necessarily native to North America or your region?
Oh, well, all the invasive species are naturalized. The fact that they grow here does not give them the license to be here. And I say that because even after 400 years, and that's the longest data set we have, the insects still can't use them. So the adaptation's not happening. Just being able to grow here and survive does not mean they're fulfilling their ecological role. So back east, we've got Phragmites, the common reed. The genotype is from Europe. In Europe, it supports 171 species of insects. Here, it's been here 400 years, and it supports 5. So that's how fast the adaptation's happening. It's really not. So naturalized, no. Pure, a lot of people want to do assisted migration these days, where they're taking a southern plant and moving it far north. They say, well, climate change, global warming, I'm going to plant for the future. Remember a few weeks ago? Minus 40. We've got climate change, but we've got climate variability. It's increased variability. The jet stream's going like this. I would not move any southern plant up north because they're going to get clobbered by those bomb cyclones and polar vortexes and all the other things that are coming more frequently. The best bet is to, now, does it have to be from 100 yards down the street? No, particularly if you're trying to meet the needs of food webs. The insects that eat plants, so if I'm an insect and I eat a beech tree, beech grows from Florida to Canada, and the insect will eat any of those beeches. They don't care where it is. You have to meet the plant's provenance. Where are you going to plant your plant where the genotype matches your conditions? That's what you want to go for. So there's a little wiggle room there, but not thousands of miles of wiggle room.
All right, how about areas that people own that are not currently lawn, such as forests? What are the priorities for dealing with those types of environments?
Well, then you're talking about forest management. Most of the time, so if you hire a forester to manage your forest, he's managing it for board feet. How many board feet can you harvest out of that woodlot, that forest? And that's okay. You're getting a product out of it. You don't have to do that, though. You can just let it go. What you want to do is have the species that belong there. You want to have a variety of age classes. So you don't want them, if they're all mature ponderosa pine, you need some young ones, too. You need a diversity of ages. That's part of the problems with the mountain pine beetle, is that we suppressed fire and we let all of our trees become mature at the same time. And that's exactly what the pine beetle likes. So you want a diversity of ages, diversity of species that belong there. But you can, there's sustainable forest management, which is different from clear cutting. You get a good clear cut once. If you sustainably harvest, you can harvest every single year. You take the worst first instead of the best first, and then you can sustainably harvest some every year forever. That's the ideal.
Understanding the reluctance to use herbicides, I think of my own lot, and I'm immediately fearful of the explosion of dandelion and Canada thistle, which may or may not be native, but are going to make me very unpopular with my neighbors. And I'm wondering how one copes with that in terms of establishing a native area. And also, is there any role for fertilization in establishing natives?
Let's deal with the Canada thistle first. So that is an invasive that is very difficult to control without spraying, unless you want to get on your hands and knees and cut every stem and paint those. That's a real pesky one. I wouldn't bother with dandelions at all. That's more of an aesthetic problem in lawns. They actually do provide pollen and nectar for bees if you don't mow your lawn all that often, for generalist bees. But the Canada thistle can be an important issue in agriculture, and there's not much good to say about that plant. So that's I think you'd have to control that. Forget the other part of the question. Fertilization. In general, our North American soils, the plants adapted to our North American soils, particularly up where there were glaciers. Did the glaciers get down this far? You guys are glaciers? No, almost. They're adapted to poor soils, and they actually do well without a lot of fertilization. That's particularly true with woody plants. So you can kill a lot of your woodies by over-fertilizing them. They grow too quickly and their bark splits. So they're adapted to nutritionally poor soils that were left after the glaciers. We tend to supplement and fertilize way more than we need to. If you're trying to get a plant in your yard that doesn't belong there, needs a lot of supplementation, think of one that will do well with the soil that you have. That's so much easier and a whole lot fewer inputs. When you fertilize, it's very easy to over-fertilize, and then it's going to get into the watershed, and it helps create a dead zone in the Gulf states.
Thanks for coming. We control for apple maggots with sticky traps and pheromones. So is that going to create a conflict when we're trying to encourage other caterpillars?
What are you controlling for?
Apple maggots, like a
apple maggots. Well, apple maggots that's a fly. So no conflict. Those pheromones are extremely species specific.
Okay.
So there's no apple maggot pheromone that's going to attract any moth.
And codling moths then?
Same thing. They're species specific. Those are designed to attract. Now there's a little bit of some related codling type caterpillars will come, or moths will come. But no, I wouldn't worry about that. Those are ag pests. Most of them are introduced, and you can use those.
Okay, great.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah.
In most areas in mid and eastern Montana, in the floodplains, there's a large Russian olive infestation. What would be the best way to deal with that?
Yeah, you have Russian olive. We have autumn olive, two close relatives. They are nitrogen fixing. They're not legumes, but they fix nitrogen, which means they can grow anywhere. They fertilize themselves. And yeah, it's a huge invasive problem. But it's very satisfying. That's one you cut off at the base and you paint the trunk and you make a big pile of bodies. It makes it look like you've really accomplished something. So yeah, at my house it was one of the major invasives we had, and it was the easiest to control.
In terms of dealing with the things you can't control, most of this is about the land that you own and the things you can already control. But do you have any advice about large acreage of monocultures in agriculture and plantings by cities and governments and then HOAs?
Yes. Let me just talk briefly about large monocultures. If you drive across the country, first you hit corn and soybeans, and then you hit wheat, and we have to grow these things. But there are things that acreage can do at the same time to make it a little less dead. And one is to restore the vegetation along the roadsides. One of the evil parts about Roundup is how we abuse it. So we've got Roundup Ready corn and soybeans. You can spray the crop and kill all the weeds in the crop, but then we spray all the edge of the road and go right up to the roadway, and then we replace it with lawn. What's that all about? Those weeds aren't in your field anyway. You're not increasing your yield at all, and you are taking away what the monarch and all the native bees and everything else needed and coexisted with agriculture for 100 years, no problem. Monarch populations have only crashed since we've done the Roundup Ready stuff. So that's something that growers can stop doing without any cost. Actually, it'll save them money. You don't have to spray all the way up to the road. Putting in pollinator strips. There's a lot of research at the University of Iowa showing, and you can get ag kickbacks for, you do give up a little bit of acreage, but you put these pollinator strips perpendicular to the flow of water across the land. So it provides pollinator plants to your land, a wonderful conservation value. And it also intercepts additional fertilizer and any of the topsoil that's running off your property, like 90% of it. And then you get CRP money for doing that. So those are two things. And putting back the hedgerows, anytime that's an option. We took out all of our hedgerows so we could have the big machinery, but there are places where we didn't need to take them out, and they're wonderful sources for wildlife. Those are things that monoculture agriculture can do without changing the monoculture. City parks, HOAs, yeah.
But let's give Doug a good round of applause. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Doug, so very, very much. We're just so honored to have you here tonight. I just wanted to let everyone know that tonight's event was recorded, and a recording of it will be up by Tuesday, I'm told, on our website. So if you go to GallatinValleyEarthDay.org, you can see a recording and share that recording with other people. If you live in the Bozeman area, for those people in person here, I just wanted to let you know that there's a partner event, a very, very special talk next Tuesday night about wolves. It's Tuesday, January 10th at 10 p.m. at the Allen Theater in Bozeman here, and it's going to feature Doug Smith. As a lot of you probably know, he is the wolf guy, recently retired, and he helped reintroduce wolves in the Yellowstone National Park. He'll be joined by Pat Byerth, who tried to save park wolf packs as a Montana State Commissioner. So this event is free. They have open seating. Again, it's Night of the Wolves next Tuesday night at the Allen Theater at 7 p.m. So thank you so much. Good night. Take care. And we'll see you next time.